There comes a quiet moment in every person's life when something inside them pauses. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with noise or urgency. It often appears in the middle of an ordinary day, when you are simply looking at your life as it is, your circumstances, your patterns, your repeated victories and your repeated frustrations, and somewhere within that silent observation, a question begins to form, not loudly, but persistently. What if the life I see around me is not the full measure of what is possible? What if something deeper is shaping all of this? Perhaps you have felt this before. Perhaps you have sensed that the events of your life are not entirely random, that beneath the surface of daily routines and external circumstances, there is another layer of influence quietly at work. Something internal, something powerful, something that has been guiding your experiences long before you were aware of it. That sense is not imagination. It is the first sign of awakening to one of the most extraordinary truths about human existence. Your mind is not merely observing life. Your mind is participating in its creation. Most people move through life without ever questioning this. They assume that circumstances dictate their experience. They believe that opportunity, luck, or the decisions of other people determine the direction of their path. When things go well, they call it fortune. When things fall apart, they call it bad timing. Rarely does anyone stop long enough to ask a deeper question. What role is my own mind playing in all of this? And yet, if you begin to look carefully, you may notice a pattern. Certain kinds of situations seem to repeat themselves. Certain emotions appear again and again under different circumstances. Certain challenges follow you from one phase of life into another, as if they are quietly waiting for you. At the same time, there may have been moments when life seemed to flow effortlessly. Opportunities appeared unexpectedly. The right people crossed your path. Solutions revealed themselves with surprising ease. These experiences often feel mysterious, but they are not without explanation. The mind you carry within you is not a passive instrument. It is a living field of energy, constantly generating thoughts, beliefs, and expectations. Each of these inner movements carries a subtle vibration. You may not see it, just as you cannot see the waves that carry sound through the air, but its effects are real. Thought moves outward from you, interacting with the environment around you in ways that are far more influential than most people realize. Consider this for a moment. Every day your mind produces thousands of thoughts. Some are deliberate, many are automatic, some are hopeful and expansive. Others are anxious or doubtful. These thoughts do not simply appear and disappear without consequence. They form a mental atmosphere within you, a kind of internal climate that gradually shapes how you perceive the world, how you respond to opportunities, and even what kinds of situations you seem to attract into your experience. When your mind is filled with confidence, expectation, and curiosity, you begin to notice possibilities that once seemed invisible. Your actions become more decisive. Your presence becomes more engaging. People respond differently to you, often without realizing why. Doors that once seemed closed begin to appear slightly open. The world seems to meet you halfway. On the other hand, when the mind becomes saturated with fear, resentment, or doubt, the opposite effect occurs. Opportunities seem scarce. Challenges appear heavier. Interactions become strained. Even simple decisions feel complicated. In these moments, it can feel as though life itself has turned against you. Yet the difference between these two states rarely begins outside of you. It begins within the quiet activity of your own thinking. Your mind is constantly interpreting the world and projecting expectations into it. Those expectations influence your perception, your energy, your behavior, and the subtle signals you send to others. Over time, these signals organize themselves into patterns of experience that appear to confirm what you already believe. Life begins to echo the tone of your inner world. This is the creative power of the mind, not in the sense of fantasy or wishful thinking, but in the deeper sense that your thoughts participate in shaping the direction of your life. They influence what you notice, what you pursue, what you avoid, and how you respond to everything that unfolds around you. In this way, the invisible processes of thought quietly precede the visible events of your reality. For many people, This realization is both empowering and unsettling. It suggests that life is not simply something happening to you. It suggests that you are involved in its unfolding in ways you may not have recognized before. Responsibility and opportunity suddenly appear together. If your mind plays a role in shaping your experiences, then learning to understand and guide your thinking becomes one of the most valuable skills you could ever develop. This is not about forcing positive thoughts or denying the existence of difficulty. Life will always contain moments of uncertainty and challenge. The creative power of the mind does not eliminate those realities. Instead, it determines the lens through which you encounter them. A trained mind sees possibility where an untrained mind sees limitation. A directed mind searches for solutions while a drifting mind becomes trapped in problems. The remarkable truth is that the mind you possess right now already holds this potential. It does not belong only to philosophers, mystics, or exceptionally gifted individuals. It belongs to anyone willing to observe their thinking and gradually learn how to guide it. Like any powerful instrument, it becomes more effective the more consciously it is used. Think of the mind as the architect of an invisible blueprint. Long before a building appears in the physical world, its structure exists in the form of plans and measurements. In the same way, many of the conditions you experience begin as patterns of thought and belief forming quietly within you. When those patterns remain unconscious, they shape your life without your awareness. But once you begin to see them clearly, you gain the ability to revise them. This is the beginning of a different relationship with your own mind. Instead of allowing thoughts to wander wherever they please, you begin to notice them. Instead of reacting automatically to every passing feeling, you learn to pause. You recognize that the direction of your attention has consequences. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, your inner world becomes more deliberate. You may not notice dramatic changes immediately. The shift often begins as a subtle sense of clarity. You start recognizing old mental habits that once operated unnoticed. You become aware of the tone you carry into situations, and with that awareness comes the possibility of choice. From that point forward, something essential has already changed. You are no longer simply living within your thoughts. You are beginning to observe them, and that small shift marks the quiet beginning of a different kind of power, one that has always been present, waiting patiently for you to recognize it. There is an idea that quietly changes the way a person sees everything once it is truly understood. At first it sounds simple, almost too simple to be important. Yet the more deeply you examine it, the more it reveals itself as one of the most powerful principles governing human experience. Life reflects the state of your inner world, not occasionally, not symbolically, but continuously and with remarkable precision. What you think most often, what you feel most consistently, and what you expect most deeply begin to organize the experiences that appear in front of you. The outer world becomes, in many ways, a mirror of the inner one. This does not mean that every event is directly caused by a single thought, nor does it suggest that life is some mechanical system responding instantly to every passing emotion. The process is subtler than that. Your thoughts form patterns, and those patterns create a mental climate within you. Over time, that climate influences how you interpret events, how you interact with people, and how you respond to opportunities. The world you experience becomes filtered through the atmosphere of your own mind. Consider the way a mirror works. A mirror does not argue with the image placed before it. It does not judge it, correct it, or attempt to improve it. It simply reflects what is present. If you smile into a mirror, the reflection smiles back. If you frown, the reflection frowns as well. The mirror itself is neutral. The image changes only when the source changes. Life behaves in a surprisingly similar way. The experiences you encounter often reflect the beliefs, expectations, and emotional tones that dominate your inner world. You may have noticed this in moments when your outlook on life was hopeful and open. During those periods, you likely felt more willing to try new things, to speak with confidence, and to pursue opportunities that previously seemed uncertain. Your energy shifted, and the way others responded to you shifted with it. Conversations flowed more easily. Possibilities seemed closer. Even challenges felt more manageable. The world had not suddenly changed overnight. yet your experience of it was noticeably different. Now think of the opposite state. There are days when doubt quietly settles into the mind. The same environment that once felt full of opportunity suddenly appears full of obstacles. A simple conversation may feel tense. A small setback can seem like confirmation that nothing is working. Your perception narrows. You begin expecting difficulty, and your attention naturally gravitates toward the evidence that supports that expectation. The outer circumstances may not be dramatically different from before, yet the atmosphere of your experience feels heavier. This is the subtle interaction between thought, feeling, and perception. The mind acts as an interpreter of reality. It selects what to notice, what to emphasize, and what to ignore. When a particular belief becomes dominant within you, it quietly shapes your awareness. You begin to notice events that confirm the belief and overlook those that contradict it. Gradually, the belief appears to prove itself through the very experiences it helped organize. This process explains why two people can live in the same environment, yet experience life in completely different ways. One person may walk through a city seeing opportunity everywhere, new ideas, new connections, new possibilities waiting to unfold. Another person may walk through the same streets feeling surrounded by limitations and barriers. The difference does not lie entirely in the city. It lies largely in the lens through which each person views it. Your thoughts create that lens. Every belief you hold about yourself, about others, and about the nature of life contributes to the way you interpret your surroundings. If you believe that life is supportive and full of possibilities, your mind begins scanning for evidence that supports that belief. You notice encouraging interactions, creative solutions, and unexpected openings. If you believe that life is difficult and unfair, your attention naturally seeks confirmation of that idea. The mind finds what it expects to find. This does not mean that difficulties disappear simply by thinking differently. Challenges remain a part of every human life. However, the mindset you carry determines how you approach those challenges. A mind that expects growth sees difficulty as a signal to adapt and learn. A mind that expects defeat interprets the same situation as proof that nothing will improve. The circumstances may be similar, but the response and therefore the outcome can be entirely different. The emotional tone you carry also plays a powerful role in this reflective process. Thoughts are rarely isolated from feeling. When you think about your future with confidence, that thought carries a feeling of possibility. When you imagine failure, the thought carries tension or hesitation. These emotional states influence your body language, your tone of voice, and your willingness to act. Other people sense these signals, often without consciously realizing it, and respond accordingly. In this way, the vibration of your inner state begins shaping the interactions that form your daily experience. You might think of this as an invisible feedback loop between the inner and outer worlds. Your thoughts influence your feelings. Your feelings influence your actions and perceptions. Your actions and perceptions influence the experiences that unfold around you. Those experiences then reinforce the thoughts that started the cycle. When the cycle begins with empowering beliefs, the results often appear encouraging. When it begins with limiting beliefs, the outcomes tend to confirm those limitations. The remarkable aspect of this process is that it is not fixed, because the outer world is responding, in part, to your inner patterns. Those patterns can be revised. When you gradually change the way you think about yourself and about life, the mirror begins reflecting something new. It does not happen instantly, and it rarely appears dramatic in the beginning. The shift often starts with subtle differences in perception. You notice opportunities you once overlooked. You interpret events with more patience. You respond with greater clarity instead of automatic reaction. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate. Your interactions evolve. Your decisions improve. Your environment begins reflecting the changes taking place within you. What once seemed like a rigid and unchangeable world reveals itself to be far more responsive than you previously believed. The important point is not that you must control every thought or maintain perfect positivity. The mind naturally produces a wide range of ideas and emotions. What matters more is the pattern that dominates your inner landscape over time. The thoughts you repeatedly return to, the interpretations you consistently adopt. and the expectations you quietly carry begin shaping the reflection you see in your life. Once you recognize this relationship, the way you observe your own thinking begins to change. Instead of treating thoughts as random background noise, you start noticing them as signals that influence the direction of your experience. The mirror is always present, always reflecting, whether you are aware of it or not, and the moment that awareness begins to settle into the mind, even gently, the reflection you see in life starts to look a little different than it did before. There is a way to look at your mind that changes everything once you begin to understand it. Most people imagine that thoughts are private events, small mental flashes that exist only inside the boundaries of the skull and disappear a moment later. They believe thinking is something silent, contained, and harmless, but that idea is incomplete. Thought is not only something you experience internally. Thought is a force. It carries direction, influence, and energy, and when you begin to see it that way, the mind no longer appears like a quiet storage room of ideas. It begins to resemble something much more active. It becomes a broadcasting station. Imagine for a moment that every thought you think sends out a signal, not a visible beam like light, but a subtle pattern of energy moving outward into the field of life around you. Just as a radio transmitter sends waves through the air that can be received by any device tuned to the same frequency, your mind continuously emits patterns of thought that interact with the environment and the people around you. These signals do not vanish the instant they are produced. They travel outward, influencing your perception, your behavior, and the invisible atmosphere that surrounds your presence. You have likely sensed this phenomenon many times without consciously analyzing it. Think of the experience of walking into a room and immediately feeling the emotional tone before anyone speaks a word. Sometimes the atmosphere feels light and welcoming. Other times it feels tense or uneasy, even though no visible conflict is taking place. What you are sensing in those moments is not imagination. You are responding to the mental and emotional signals that others are unconsciously broadcasting. In the same way, the thoughts you carry influence the atmosphere around you. When your mind is calm, focused, and confident, your presence tends to feel steady and reassuring to others. People often respond with openness, cooperation, or curiosity. But when your mind is filled with tension, doubt, or irritation, that signal also moves outward. Even if you try to hide it behind polite words, others may feel the subtle strain beneath the surface. This does not happen through mystical forces or mysterious powers. It happens through the simple fact that thoughts shape your emotions, and emotions influence your behavior, tone, posture, and attention. Those signals become part of the environment other people experience when they interact with you. In this way, your mind is always communicating, whether you intend it to or not. But the influence of thought extends even further than interpersonal interaction. Your thoughts also shape the way you perceive the opportunities and possibilities that exist around you. When the mind is tuned toward expectation and possibility, it naturally scans the environment for ideas and openings that support that expectation. It becomes alert, curious, and engaged. Solutions appear where problems once dominated your attention. When the mind is tuned toward limitation, however, the opposite occurs. Attention narrows. You begin noticing evidence that confirms your doubts. You interpret neutral events as obstacles and overlook opportunities that do not fit your expectations. The signal your mind broadcasts internally becomes the signal it searches for externally. This is why two people can encounter the same circumstances and produce entirely different outcomes. One person approaches a challenge believing that solutions exist, and their mind immediately begins searching for ways forward. The other person approaches the same challenge convinced that failure is likely, and their mind quickly gathers reasons to confirm that belief. Both individuals are broadcasting different signals, and each signal guides the direction of their attention and effort. If you imagine your mind as a broadcasting station, the importance of mental habits becomes clearer. A station that constantly transmits one kind of signal eventually creates a recognizable pattern. Listeners tune in expecting a particular kind of content. In the same way, your repeated thoughts establish a consistent mental frequency. Over time, This frequency shapes the tone of your experiences. For example, a mind that repeatedly broadcasts gratitude, curiosity, and confidence gradually develops an orientation toward growth. That person begins noticing encouraging possibilities, developing supportive relationships, and recognizing patterns that lead to progress. The signal they send and the signal they receive reinforce each other. On the other hand, a mind that consistently broadcasts resentment, fear, or discouragement gradually becomes surrounded by experiences that feel heavy and restrictive. This does not happen because the universe is punishing negative thoughts. It happens because the signal being transmitted influences how that person interprets events, how they act, and what they choose to pursue or avoid. The most important realization in this idea is that broadcasting is not optional. Your mind is transmitting signals continuously, whether you are aware of it or not. Every expectation, every belief about yourself, and every assumption about the future becomes part of the signal you are sending into the world. You cannot switch the transmitter off entirely. The only real choice you possess is deciding what kind of signal you want to send. Many people live without ever considering this. Their thoughts drift from one concern to another, influenced by news headlines, passing conversations, old memories, or imagined worries about the future. Because the signal constantly changes, their experiences often feel chaotic or inconsistent. Life appears unpredictable, not because the world is random, but because their mental broadcast lacks direction. Once you begin observing your thoughts more carefully, however, you may notice that certain patterns dominate your thinking. Perhaps you tend to expect criticism, or perhaps you frequently anticipate success. Maybe your mind habitually searches for problems, or perhaps it looks for possibilities. These patterns form the core of your mental broadcast. The moment you recognize this, a new level of awareness becomes available. Instead of allowing every passing thought to shape your signal, you can begin choosing which ideas deserve your attention. This does not require suppressing every negative feeling or forcing artificial optimism. It simply requires noticing the direction of your thinking and deciding whether it aligns with the kind of experiences you wish to create. Over time, the practice of directing your thoughts becomes more natural. The mind gradually learns to return to certain kinds of ideas, clarity instead of confusion, possibility instead of limitation, curiosity instead of fear. The broadcast changes, and when the broadcast changes, the way you interact with life changes as well. Nothing dramatic needs to happen for this shift to begin. The transmitter has always been there, quietly active, sending signals into the world through every thought you entertain. The only difference now is that you are beginning to recognize it. And once you notice a mechanism that has been operating all along, it becomes difficult to pretend it was never there. Walk outside on 2 different mornings and you may encounter 2 entirely different worlds, even though the streets, the buildings, and the people around you remain the same. On one morning, everything feels light, cooperative, almost welcoming. Conversations unfold easily, ideas arrive quickly, and progress seems natural. On another morning, the same environment feels heavy. Small inconveniences irritate you. Opportunities seem distant. The day appears resistant to your efforts. Nothing in the external structure of the world has dramatically changed, yet your experience of it feels completely different. What has shifted is the inner climate through which you are meeting life. The law of attraction is often misunderstood because people imagine it as something mystical, unpredictable, or overly simplified. Some reduce it to the idea that merely wishing for something strongly enough will make it appear. Others dismiss it entirely because they see no evidence that simple desire alone can reshape the world. But the deeper principle behind the law of attraction is neither naive optimism nor magical thinking. It is the recognition that your inner state consistently influences the kinds of experiences you move toward and the kinds of experiences that seem to move toward you. Think of your inner world as a climate rather than a single moment of thought. Just as weather patterns form from repeated atmospheric conditions, the mental environment within you forms from repeated thoughts, expectations, and emotional tendencies. One isolated moment of doubt does not determine your future, just as one cloud does not define a season. But when certain mental patterns repeat often enough, They create a stable atmosphere. That atmosphere becomes the background condition from which your actions, interpretations, and interactions naturally arise. If your inner climate is dominated by anticipation and curiosity, your mind begins scanning the environment for possibilities that match that tone. You become more willing to explore, to communicate, to experiment. Your energy carries a sense of openness that others can feel. Opportunities that might have gone unnoticed under a different mental state begin to stand out, not because the world suddenly reorganized itself overnight, but because your attention and behavior aligned with the kinds of experiences that thrive under that climate. On the other hand, if the dominant climate of the mind is shaped by discouragement or resentment, perception changes. The mind searches for confirmation that difficulties are everywhere. You become cautious, hesitant, or withdrawn. Conversations feel strained because the expectation of conflict or disappointment quietly colors your tone. The world begins to appear less cooperative, and each negative experience reinforces the atmosphere that produced it. This is where responsibility quietly enters the picture. The law of attraction does not operate like a judge rewarding good thoughts and punishing negative ones. It functions more like a mirror responding to the conditions presented to it. When your inner climate changes, the patterns you notice and participate in begin to change as well. Understanding this principle means recognizing that the emotional and mental environment you cultivate matters far more than many people realize. Responsibility in this sense is not about blame. It is about influence. The moment you recognize that your internal atmosphere affects your experiences, you gain the ability to shape that atmosphere intentionally. Instead of allowing the mind to absorb every passing mood from the world around you, you begin observing the tone you carry into situations. You notice the difference between reacting automatically and choosing a more deliberate response. For example, imagine entering a conversation expecting criticism. Even if the other person begins neutrally, your anticipation may cause you to interpret their words defensively. Your tone shifts, your posture tightens, and the interaction gradually becomes tense. The expectation you carried into the moment begins shaping the outcome. Now imagine entering the same conversation expecting understanding and cooperation. Your attention becomes more patient. You listen more carefully. The atmosphere changes, and the interaction often unfolds in a completely different way. This does not mean you can control every external circumstance. The world remains complex and unpredictable in many ways. However, the inner climate you maintain influences how you move through those circumstances. A calm and steady mind is better equipped to recognize solutions. A hopeful mind is more willing to continue searching for opportunity after setbacks. A curious mind sees learning where another mind sees only failure. One of the most important aspects of understanding this principle is recognizing how easily the inner climate can be influenced by external noise. News headlines, social conversations, past disappointments, and imagined fears can all feed the mental atmosphere if they are repeated often enough. When this happens, the mind begins reacting to conditions that may not even be present in the immediate moment. Anxiety about the future or resentment about the past quietly becomes the emotional weather of the present. Learning to manage your inner climate does not require suppressing emotions or pretending difficulties do not exist. Emotions are natural responses to experience. The key difference lies in how long you allow them to dominate your mental environment. When a discouraging event occurs, you can acknowledge it honestly without allowing it to define the entire atmosphere of your thinking. You can examine the situation, respond appropriately, and then consciously return your attention to the direction you want your life to move. In this way, the law of attraction becomes less about trying to force reality into a desired shape and more about cultivating a mental environment where constructive possibilities can emerge. Instead of chasing results through constant struggle, you focus on maintaining a state of clarity, openness, and purposeful attention. From that state, your actions tend to align more naturally with the outcomes you seek. There is also an interesting paradox hidden within this idea. The more deliberately you care for your inner climate, the less desperate you feel about controlling external events. When the mind is stable and directed, it becomes easier to act with patience and confidence. You stop chasing every temporary result, because your attention rests on the broader direction of your growth. The outer world gradually begins reflecting that steadiness. At first, this shift may feel subtle. You might simply notice that certain situations no longer disturb you the way they once did. Small obstacles seem less overwhelming. Conversations become easier to navigate. Gradually, the reflection becomes clearer. New possibilities appear, not because they suddenly materialized from nowhere, but because the mental atmosphere that once prevented you from recognizing them has quietly changed. And as that realization settles into place, the question of what you carry within you begins to feel far more significant than the circumstances waiting outside your door. Long before modern psychology began studying the patterns of human thought, observers of life noticed something curious about the way people seem to encounter certain kinds of experiences again and again. Some individuals appear to move through environments where cooperation and opportunity emerge naturally. Others seem to encounter resistance at nearly every turn, even when they possess similar skills or resources. The difference is rarely explained entirely by circumstance. Something more subtle is at work beneath the visible structure of events. The mind itself behaves like a living magnet, interacting with a vast field of thought and emotion that surrounds all human life. A magnet does not select what it attracts through deliberate choice. Its behavior is governed by its internal structure. Metal objects that share its magnetic properties are drawn toward it, while other materials remain unaffected. The magnet is simply responding according to its nature. In a similar way, the human mind continually interacts with the environment around it through the patterns of belief, expectation, and emotional tone that it carries. Those patterns create a kind of psychological polarity that influences the experiences we move toward and the experiences that move toward us. This interaction becomes easier to understand when you recognize that human beings are not isolated thinkers living in sealed mental containers. Every person exists within a shared field of communication and influence. Ideas circulate through conversations, media, cultural expectations, and personal relationships. Emotional states also move through this field. Enthusiasm spreads quickly in a motivated group. Anxiety spreads just as quickly in a worried one. Each mind contributes something to the atmosphere that others encounter. Because of this shared environment, the thoughts you repeatedly entertain begin shaping how you respond to the signals coming from the world around you. If your dominant expectation is that people are cooperative and opportunities exist, your attention naturally tunes itself toward behaviors and situations that confirm that assumption. You notice potential collaborations. You interpret neutral interactions more positively. You remain open to exploring possibilities rather than withdrawing prematurely. In effect, your mental magnet begins aligning you with patterns that resonate with the expectations you hold. Now imagine the opposite orientation. If your mind repeatedly focuses on suspicion, disappointment, or limitation, your attention begins scanning the environment for signals that support those ideas. A neutral comment from someone else might be interpreted as criticism. A temporary obstacle might be seen as proof that success is unlikely. The same shared environment that once contained many possibilities now appears filled with confirmation of your doubts. The magnet of the mind is still operating, but it is drawing attention toward a different set of experiences. One of the most revealing aspects of this principle is that the magnetism of the mind is not limited to external opportunities alone. It also influences the people you connect with and the emotional atmosphere you tend to inhabit. Individuals who consistently carry curiosity and constructive energy often find themselves surrounded by others who share similar attitudes. Their conversations revolve around ideas, growth, and problem-solving. Over time, these interactions reinforce the mindset that produced them. In contrast, someone who frequently dwells on frustration or resentment may find themselves repeatedly engaging with conversations that revolve around complaint and dissatisfaction. Again, this does not occur because the world deliberately assigns people to specific categories. It occurs because individuals naturally resonate with the mental and emotional tones that feel familiar. The mind, acting like a magnet, moves toward environments where its patterns are reinforced. It is important to understand that this magnetic behavior is not a rigid law that forces identical experiences upon everyone who shares similar thoughts. Human life remains complex and influenced by many variables. However, the general direction of attention, interaction, and opportunity is strongly affected by the internal orientation of the mind. When certain expectations dominate your thinking, they quietly guide your awareness towards situations that appear to confirm them. Consider how this plays out in everyday situations. Imagine someone who carries a steady belief that solutions can be found even in challenging circumstances. When difficulties arise, this person begins searching for alternatives rather than immediately concluding that failure is inevitable. They ask questions, seek advice, experiment with different approaches, and remain mentally engaged with the possibility of progress. Their actions increase the likelihood that they will eventually discover an effective solution. Another person facing the same challenge might begin from a belief that the situation is already hopeless. Their attention quickly turns toward reasons why improvement is unlikely. Because their energy moves toward resignation rather than exploration, they often abandon potential solutions before they are fully examined. The result appears to confirm their expectation, reinforcing the belief that nothing works out for them. Both individuals existed within the same shared environment, yet the magnetic orientation of their thinking led them toward different outcomes. The first mind moved through the field of possibility like a compass pointing toward opportunity. The second moved through the same field as if it were drawn toward evidence of limitation. This does not mean that positive thinking guarantees effortless success, or that negative thinking permanently traps someone in difficulty. Life contains unpredictable elements that affect everyone. What the magnetic nature of the mind suggests, however, is that the direction of your habitual thinking strongly influences the path your actions and perceptions follow through that unpredictability. Another important aspect of this shared field of influence is the way emotional states can amplify the magnetic effect of thought. Thoughts, accompanied by strong feeling, tend to hold attention more firmly. They linger in the mind, shaping perception and behavior more powerfully than passing ideas. When someone feels deeply engaged with a goal or purpose, their mental magnet becomes more focused. Their attention returns repeatedly to the same direction, and their actions gradually organize themselves around that orientation. Over time, this consistent direction produces visible results. People who observe the outcome may describe it as determination, persistence, or clarity of purpose. Yet beneath those descriptions lies the quiet influence of the mind's magnetic focus guiding attention, behavior, and interaction toward a particular set of possibilities. Understanding the mind as a living magnet does not require you to control every passing thought or eliminate all moments of doubt. Human thinking naturally fluctuates. What matters more is the pattern that dominates over time. The expectations you return to most often, the emotional tone you reinforce through repeated reflection, and the beliefs you quietly accept as true gradually shape the orientation of your mental magnet. As this idea becomes clearer, it begins changing the way you observe your own thinking. Instead of seeing thoughts as isolated events with little consequence, you start recognizing them as signals that influence how you move through a shared field of energy and interaction. The direction of that signal may not always be obvious in the moment, but its presence becomes difficult to ignore once you begin noticing how consistently it shapes the path your attention follows. Two musical instruments placed in the same room can demonstrate a fascinating phenomenon. If a single note is struck on one instrument, another instrument tuned to the same pitch may begin to vibrate even though no one touches it. The sound travels through the air, and the second instrument responds because it is built to resonate with that particular frequency. The connection is invisible, yet unmistakably real. Something similar happens constantly within the mental and emotional life of human beings. Thoughts do not exist in isolation. They resonate, interact, and influence one another through patterns of attention and emotion that flow through the shared atmosphere of human experience. Every thought you hold carries a certain tone. Some thoughts feel expansive, steady, and confident. Others feel tense, doubtful, or uncertain. These tones influence how you perceive the signals coming from the world around you. When your mind repeatedly focuses on a particular emotional frequency, it becomes more sensitive to similar frequencies in your environment. In this way, The mind is not only sending signals outward, it is also receiving signals that match its current orientation. Consider how quickly a mood can spread through a group of people. One individual enters a conversation feeling enthusiastic about an idea. Their energy is animated, their voice carries conviction, and their attention remains focused on possibilities. Within minutes, the atmosphere of the room may change. Others begin contributing suggestions. Curiosity grows. The conversation becomes productive. No one consciously decides to shift the emotional tone. Yet the shift occurs because one person's mental and emotional vibration resonated with the attention of others. Now imagine a different situation. Someone arrives carrying frustration or discouragement. Their words emphasize problems rather than possibilities. Their tone communicates doubt. Soon the conversation slows down. Energy drains from the discussion. Even those who originally felt optimistic may begin mirroring the same discouraging tone. Once again, the shift happens through resonance rather than deliberate agreement. The mental atmosphere adjusts to the dominant signal being expressed. This dynamic does not only occur in group settings, it also operates within your personal perception of the world. When your mind is tuned toward curiosity and growth, you naturally recognize ideas and opportunities that align with that frequency. Information that supports progress stands out more clearly. Conversations that stimulate learning feel more engaging. Your mind becomes a receiver for signals that match your internal orientation. In contrast, when the mind becomes saturated with worry or suspicion, it begins filtering incoming information through that same frequency. Neutral events may appear threatening. Constructive feedback might feel like criticism. Opportunities can be overlooked because they do not fit the expectation of difficulty. The mind is still receiving signals, but it is interpreting them according to the emotional wavelength it currently holds. The principle behind this process can be described as mental resonance. Just as two tuning forks vibrate together when they share the same pitch, thoughts and emotions tend to align with similar patterns in the surrounding environment. This does not mean that the world reorganizes itself instantly to match every thought you have. Rather, it means that your awareness and behavior begin aligning with signals that resonate with your current state of mind. For example, imagine walking into a new environment while feeling confident and open to connection. Your posture reflects that openness. Your attention naturally moves toward people who appear receptive. You speak with clarity, listen with interest, and respond thoughtfully. These behaviors encourage positive interactions, which in turn reinforce your sense of confidence. The resonance between your inner state and the responses you receive strengthens the experience. Now imagine entering the same environment carrying hesitation and self-doubt. You may avoid eye contact, speak cautiously, or assume that others are uninterested in conversation. Because of these signals, people may respond with distance or indifference. That response reinforces the original feeling of uncertainty, creating a cycle that seems to confirm the expectation you brought with you. Neither outcome is predetermined by fate. Both arise through a process of resonance between inner orientation and external response. Your thoughts set the tone of the signal you broadcast, and that signal influences which aspects of the environment become most noticeable and responsive to you. Another dimension of mental resonance involves the way ideas travel between individuals over time. When many people repeatedly focus on similar concerns or aspirations, a collective atmosphere forms. Cultural movements, social trends, and widespread emotional reactions often develop through this accumulation of shared attention. Individuals contribute to this atmosphere through their thoughts and conversations, and they also absorb its influence in return. Because of this shared field, maintaining awareness of your mental state becomes increasingly important. If your mind is unfocused or reactive, it may easily absorb the dominant emotional signals circulating in the environment. Anxiety, anger, or pessimism present in the surrounding culture can quickly become internal habits if they are repeated often enough. Without noticing, your internal tone begins echoing the same patterns that fill the collective atmosphere. However, when your mind develops clarity and steadiness, you gain the ability to participate in the shared field without being overwhelmed by it. You still perceive what others are expressing, but you are not automatically pulled into the same emotional current. Instead, your own mental orientation begins contributing a stabilizing influence to the environment around you. The signal you broadcast remains consistent even when other signals fluctuate. This steadiness gradually changes how interactions unfold. People may feel calmer in your presence because your responses do not amplify tension. Conversations may become more thoughtful because your attention encourages clarity rather than reaction. Opportunities that require patience and focus may become more visible because your mind remains receptive to them. In each case, resonance continues to operate, but the tone you carry helps guide the direction of the exchange. Understanding mental resonance does not mean attempting to control every signal around you. The shared environment of human thought will always contain a wide range of emotional frequencies. What matters more is the signal you choose to maintain within yourself. The tone of your thoughts becomes the reference point that determines which signals feel familiar and which ones pass by without taking hold. Over time, the practice of observing and guiding your inner state allows you to participate in this field of influence more consciously. Instead of reacting automatically to every emotional ripple that passes through your environment, you begin noticing the resonance between your thoughts and the experiences unfolding around you. The signals are still moving in both directions, yet the awareness of that exchange quietly changes how you stand within it. Spend a few minutes quietly observing your own thoughts, and something curious begins to reveal itself. At one moment you are deliberately thinking about something, perhaps planning, deciding, analyzing, or imagining a future possibility. In the next moment, thoughts appear that you did not intentionally choose. Memories surface without invitation. Old worries replay themselves automatically. Emotional reactions emerge before you have time to question them. It can feel as if part of the mind is directing your thinking while another part is simply running on its own momentum. This is not confusion or weakness. It is evidence of something fundamental about the human mind. You are not operating with a single mental system. You are operating with two. The first of these is what we may call the active mind. This is the part of your awareness that chooses. It decides what to focus on, what to say, what to believe, and what direction to move toward. When you concentrate on a problem, analyze information, plan a project, or consciously imagine a different future, the active mind is at work. It is the thinking center that allows you to reason, evaluate, and direct attention. The active mind is the commander of thought, but it is not the entire structure of your mental life. Beneath this surface level of decision and analysis lies another system, often quieter but far more constant in its influence. This is the passive mind, sometimes described as the subconscious. Unlike the active mind, it does not argue, analyze, or debate. It does not ask whether an idea is logical or whether a belief is accurate. Instead, the passive mind absorbs impressions. It records repeated thoughts, emotional reactions, habits, and experiences. Once these impressions are established, it begins expressing them automatically through feelings, instincts, and patterns of behavior. Think about how habits develop. When you first learn a new skill, the active mind must guide every step. You consciously think about each movement, each decision, each adjustment, but after repeating the action many times, the effort gradually disappears. The behavior becomes automatic. You no longer think about every detail, yet the action continues smoothly. The passive mind has absorbed the pattern and now carries it out without requiring constant direction. This same process occurs with emotional and mental habits. If someone repeatedly tells themselves that they are not capable, the active mind may initially resist that idea. But if the thought is repeated often enough, perhaps reinforced by past disappointments or external criticism, the passive mind begins accepting it as a pattern. Once accepted, the belief expresses itself automatically. Doubt appears before new opportunities are explored. Fear arises before action begins. The passive mind simply repeats what it has learned. The opposite process can occur as well. When the active mind repeatedly focuses on constructive ideas, confidence, curiosity, persistence, those ideas gradually become familiar patterns. The passive mind absorbs them and begins generating the same responses automatically. Situations that once triggered hesitation now evoke determination. Opportunities that once seemed intimidating begin to feel manageable. The difference lies not in a sudden change of external circumstance, but in the impressions that have been installed within the passive mind. One of the most important things to understand about this relationship is that the passive mind does not distinguish between helpful and harmful impressions. It accepts what it is given. If fear is repeated often enough, fear becomes a pattern. If patience is practiced consistently, patience becomes a pattern. The passive mind does not judge the material it receives. It simply learns from repetition and emotional intensity. This explains why certain reactions appear so quickly in daily life. You may notice that a specific type of criticism instantly triggers defensiveness, or that certain situations immediately evoke worry. These responses often originate from patterns that the passive mind has rehearsed many times before. They occur so rapidly that the active mind sometimes feels as though it has little control over them. However, recognizing this structure reveals an important opportunity. The active mind, though quieter and sometimes slower to respond, holds the power of direction. It can choose new thoughts. It can question old beliefs. It can introduce different interpretations of events. Each time the active mind deliberately chooses a new idea and repeats it with attention, it begins placing a new impression into the passive mind. At first, the passive mind may continue expressing the old patterns. Habits do not dissolve instantly, but as the new impressions accumulate, the balance gradually shifts. The passive mind begins reproducing the new patterns with the same consistency it once gave to the old ones. What once required effort eventually becomes natural. Consider how this applies to everyday thinking. If the active mind frequently dwells on past disappointments, the passive mind stores those experiences as expectations for the future. The next time a challenge appears, the emotional response may already be shaped by those stored impressions. But if the active mind begins practicing a different orientation, observing setbacks as temporary, recognizing small progress, and reinforcing constructive interpretations, the passive mind slowly absorbs these new patterns. Over time, the emotional baseline of the mind changes. This process requires patience, because the passive mind responds more strongly to repetition than to single moments of effort. A thought repeated with consistency carries far greater influence than an idea considered only occasionally. The active mind may choose a new direction in an instant, but the passive mind adopts that direction gradually through repeated experience. Understanding the two minds within you transforms the way you approach personal change. Instead of expecting instant emotional transformation, you begin seeing change as a training process. The active mind becomes the instructor, introducing new ideas and reinforcing them with attention. The passive mind becomes the student, absorbing these ideas until they eventually become automatic responses. When this cooperation develops, the entire structure of thought begins working more harmoniously. The active mind no longer struggles constantly against old habits, because the passive mind gradually supports the same direction. Decisions become clearer. Emotional reactions become steadier. The mind begins operating as a coordinated system rather than a collection of conflicting impulses. Most people never notice this internal partnership. They experience the reactions of the passive mind and assume those reactions represent unchangeable aspects of their personality. Yet the structure of the mind itself suggests otherwise. Patterns can be replaced because they were learned in the first place. Once this realization becomes clear, the way you observe your thoughts begins to change. What once seemed like an unpredictable stream of reactions begins to look more like a conversation between two parts of the same mind, one choosing the direction, the other learning how to follow it. Watch a path form across a field and you will understand something important about the way the mind develops its patterns. At first, the grass stands upright and untouched. One person crosses the field and leaves only a faint trace. Another follows the same route the next day, and the mark becomes slightly more visible. After enough people walk the same direction, a clear path appears. The grass bends, the soil compacts, and the route becomes the easiest way to travel from one side of the field to the other. The human mind forms its inner patterns in much the same way. Thoughts repeated often enough carve invisible paths into the deeper layers of awareness. And once those paths exist, the mind begins traveling them automatically. Repetition is one of the most powerful forces shaping the structure of your inner world. A single thought may pass through the mind without leaving much influence, but a thought that returns again and again gradually becomes familiar. Familiarity leads to acceptance, and acceptance eventually leads to habit. This is how beliefs form, how emotional responses develop, and how certain ways of interpreting life become so natural that they feel like permanent aspects of your personality. Many of these inner patterns begin forming long before a person becomes aware of them. Early experiences, repeated messages from family or society, and emotionally charged moments often leave strong impressions. When the same idea is encountered repeatedly, the mind begins assuming that it represents reality. For example, a child who frequently hears that success is difficult or that mistakes should be feared may internalize those ideas as quiet expectations. Over time, those expectations shape how the person approaches opportunities and challenges. However, repetition does not only occur through external influences. The thoughts you repeat to yourself also carry enormous power. Every time you mentally revisit a worry, rehearse a disappointment, or imagine a negative outcome, you are strengthening a particular pathway in the mind. The repetition itself, not the intensity of the moment, gradually establishes the pattern. The more often the mind travels a particular route, the more natural that route becomes. This explains why certain thoughts seem to appear automatically. If a person has spent years repeating the same interpretation of events, perhaps assuming criticism whenever feedback is offered or expecting failure before beginning something new, that interpretation eventually becomes the mind's default response. The passive mind, which absorbs patterns through repetition, continues generating the same reactions even when circumstances change. Fortunately, the same mechanism that forms limiting patterns can also create empowering ones. When a new idea is introduced and repeated consistently, it begins forming a new path through the mental landscape. At first, the mind may resist it because the older pathways feel more familiar, but with steady attention, the new thought gradually becomes easier to access. Over time, the old pattern weakens simply because it is no longer being reinforced as frequently. Impressions play an important role in this process. An impression is a thought or image that carries emotional weight or repeated attention. When a thought is accompanied by feeling, whether excitement, fear, determination, or curiosity, it tends to settle more deeply into the passive mind. Emotion acts like pressure on the soil of that mental field, pressing the pattern into place more firmly. This is why moments of intense experience often leave lasting mental marks. A powerful success can reinforce confidence. A painful disappointment can strengthen caution, but repetition is still the deciding factor. If the mind returns repeatedly to the memory of the disappointment, the pattern deepens. If the mind chooses to focus more often on lessons learned and possibilities ahead, a different pathway begins forming. One way to observe this mechanism in everyday life is by noticing the internal language you use when reflecting on your experiences. Some people constantly repeat phrases such as, "This always happens to me," or "Nothing ever works out." These statements may seem like simple expressions of frustration, yet every repetition reinforces the pattern behind them. The passive mind absorbs the statement as an instruction, gradually shaping expectations to match it. On the other hand, when a person repeatedly reminds themselves of growth, possibility, and resilience, those ideas also become familiar. Over time, the mind begins responding to challenges with greater flexibility. Instead of automatically returning to the old pathway of discouragement, it finds a new route that leads toward problem-solving and learning. The formation of inner patterns is not an overnight process. Just as the path across the field develops through many footsteps rather than one, mental habits develop through repeated attention rather than a single thought. This is why sudden attempts to change one's thinking often feel ineffective at first. A person may decide to adopt a new belief but abandon it quickly because the old pattern still feels stronger. In reality, the new pathway simply has not been traveled often enough yet. Consistency is the quiet force that gradually reshapes these patterns. Each time, the active mind chooses a constructive interpretation instead of the old familiar one. The new pathway becomes slightly clearer. Each time attention returns to a more empowering idea, the impression deepens. Eventually, the new pattern becomes the easier route for the mind to follow. Visualization and imagination can also contribute to this process. When the mind vividly imagines a future experience, seeing the details, feeling the emotional tone, and returning to that image repeatedly, it begins forming impressions similar to those created by real experiences. The passive mind does not strictly separate imagination from physical memory. It responds primarily to the repetition and emotional quality of the thought. This is why mental rehearsal is often used by athletes, performers, and innovators. By repeating the imagined experience, they gradually install the pattern of confidence and clarity before the event occurs. Understanding the relationship between repetition and impression shifts the way you approach your own thinking. Instead of reacting to every passing thought as though it defines you, you begin noticing which ideas receive your repeated attention. You recognize that the patterns shaping your experience are often the result of accumulated repetitions rather than fixed truths about who you are. Once that awareness develops, the formation of inner patterns becomes something you can observe rather than something that simply happens to you. Each repeated thought becomes a small step along a mental path. Some paths lead toward limitation, others toward possibility. The direction becomes clearer the more often the mind travels it, and the landscape of your inner world gradually takes shape beneath the quiet rhythm of repetition. Left on its own, the human mind behaves very much like a river after heavy rain. Thoughts rush in many directions at once. One idea leads to another, then another, and before long attention has drifted far away from where it originally began. Memories from the past appear. Worries about the future slip in quietly, and the mind begins reacting to every passing impression. For most people, this constant movement feels normal. They assume thinking is something that simply happens to them. Yet hidden within the structure of the mind is a remarkable ability that changes everything once it is recognized. That ability is the will. The will is the faculty that allows you to choose a direction for your attention and keep it there. It is not merely the ability to make decisions. Decisions can be made quickly and then forgotten moments later. The will goes further than that. It holds a thought in place. It returns to an idea again and again, even when distractions appear. When the will is engaged, the mind stops drifting aimlessly and begins moving with intention. Imagine the difference between sunlight spreading across a field and sunlight concentrated through a magnifying glass. In the first case, the light touches everything lightly but transforms very little. In the second case, the same light becomes focused and powerful enough to ignite a small flame. The energy has not changed, but the concentration has. The will functions like that magnifying lens for the mind. It gathers scattered thoughts and directs them toward a chosen point. Without the influence of willpower, the mind becomes easily shaped by external conditions. News, conversations, passing moods, and sudden memories all compete for attention. Because attention constantly shifts, no single idea remains long enough to form a strong impression. The passive mind absorbs whatever appears most frequently, which means that outside influences begin shaping the inner world more than deliberate choice. When the will becomes active, this relationship begins to reverse. Instead of allowing attention to follow every distraction, you begin guiding it deliberately. If you decide to concentrate on a particular goal, the will keeps bringing your focus back to that idea whenever the mind wanders. If you choose to cultivate confidence instead of fear, the will quietly interrupts the old pattern and redirects attention toward the new one. Each return strengthens the pathway of the chosen thought. This does not mean the mind will suddenly become silent or perfectly disciplined. Distractions will still appear. Doubts may still arise. The difference lies in how long they remain in control. With a trained will, the mind does not remain lost in those distractions for very long. Attention gently returns to the thought that was intentionally chosen. Consider how this ability operates in practical life. A person who develops strong concentration can study for long periods without drifting into constant distraction. Another individual may struggle to read even a few pages before checking a phone or thinking about unrelated matters. The difference is not intelligence, but the strength of the will directing attention. The same principle applies to emotional patterns. When discouraging thoughts appear, The mind without direction may begin repeating them automatically. One negative idea leads to another until the entire mental atmosphere becomes heavy. But when the will is engaged, a different response becomes possible. The moment the discouraging thought appears, attention can be redirected toward a more constructive interpretation. The mind may attempt to return to the old pattern, yet the will continues, guiding it back toward the chosen direction. This steady guidance gradually reshapes the patterns within the passive mind. Because the passive mind responds strongly to repetition, every moment of redirected attention becomes a new impression. At first, the effort may feel deliberate and slow, but as the new pattern strengthens, the passive mind begins supporting the same direction. What once required effort gradually becomes natural. The will also plays a crucial role in imagination. When you imagine a future possibility, the active mind creates an image or idea, but the will determines how long that image remains alive in your awareness. If the mind quickly abandons the image, the impression remains weak. But if the will holds the image steadily, returning to it repeatedly with clarity and feeling, the passive mind begins accepting it as a familiar pattern. This is why many successful individuals speak about persistence in visualization or focused thinking. They are not relying on brief moments of inspiration. They are using the will to sustain attention long enough for a new idea to become embedded within the deeper layers of the mind. It is also important to recognize that the will strengthens through use. Just as a muscle grows stronger through repeated exercise, the ability to hold attention improves through practice. Small moments of focus gradually build greater stability. Each time you bring the mind back to a chosen thought instead of allowing it to drift, the will becomes slightly more capable of guiding attention again in the future. Many people underestimate the quiet power of this process because it appears simple. Redirecting attention may seem insignificant compared to dramatic external actions. Yet the patterns of thought guiding those actions are shaped through this very process. When the will consistently holds certain ideas in place, clarity of purpose, confidence in progress, patience in difficulty, the passive mind gradually accepts those ideas as its natural orientation. Over time, the relationship between thought and action begins to shift. Instead of reacting impulsively to every emotional impulse, the mind pauses briefly. The will provides a moment of direction. Attention moves toward the thought that aligns with your chosen purpose, rather than the thought that happened to appear first. Decisions become steadier because they are guided by intention rather than by the strongest passing mood. The presence of will does not remove uncertainty from life, nor does it guarantee immediate results. What it provides is something quieter but equally powerful: the ability to remain mentally aligned with a direction, even when distractions and doubts attempt to pull attention away. That alignment gradually organizes thoughts, emotions, and actions around a consistent center. And once a person begins recognizing that this guiding force has always been present within the mind, the act of thinking itself starts to look less like a stream carrying you wherever it wishes, and more like a current that can be steered with patience and awareness. Picture yourself standing in the middle of a crowded marketplace. Voices are everywhere. Some are calm, some impatient, some excited, some fearful. Each voice is trying to capture attention. Now imagine that instead of reacting to every sound around you, you quietly decide which voice you will listen to and which ones you will allow to fade into the background. That small decision represents something deeper than simple preference. It reflects a kind of authority over your own attention. In the inner world of the mind, this same authority exists, and learning to use it is one of the most transformative shifts a person can make. Much of human thinking happens automatically. Thoughts appear in response to news headlines, conversations, memories, and emotional reactions. One idea leads to another until the mind becomes filled with impressions that were never consciously selected. When this happens repeatedly, it begins to feel as though your emotional state is controlled by external circumstances. A stressful event creates tension, a negative comment triggers doubt, a disappointing result leads to discouragement. Life seems to dictate the inner atmosphere of the mind. Yet beneath these reactions lies a quieter capacity, the ability to choose the tone of your own thinking. This capacity can be described as inner authority. It is the recognition that while you cannot always control the events that occur around you, you can choose how long certain thoughts remain in your awareness and which ideas you will reinforce through attention. That choice determines the vibration of your inner world. Vibration in this context does not refer to something mystical or mysterious. It simply describes the emotional tone carried by your thoughts. Some thoughts produce a feeling of openness and possibility. Others produce tension, resistance, or discouragement. These emotional tones influence how you interpret situations, how you speak to others, and how you respond to opportunities. Over time, they form the atmosphere through which you experience life. Most people assume that this atmosphere is a direct result of circumstances. When something pleasant happens, the emotional tone rises. When something difficult occurs, the tone falls. While circumstances certainly influence feelings, they are not the only factor involved. The interpretation you give to an event often determines the lasting emotional vibration far more than the event itself. Consider two individuals facing the same challenge. One interprets the situation as proof that progress is impossible. The other views it as part of the learning process that eventually leads to improvement. The external event is identical, yet the internal vibrations created by these interpretations are completely different. The first produces discouragement and withdrawal. The second produces patience and curiosity. Over time, those emotional orientations guide the direction of action and experience. Inner authority begins the moment you recognize that interpretation is not fixed. Thoughts that appear automatically do not have to remain unexamined. When a discouraging idea arises, you can pause and observe it rather than immediately accepting it as truth. That pause creates a small but powerful opening. Within that opening, you can decide whether the thought deserves your continued attention. At first, this may feel unfamiliar because the mind is accustomed to reacting quickly. Emotions move rapidly, and habitual thoughts often follow well-worn patterns. But with practice, the pause becomes more natural. Instead of being carried away by the first emotional reaction, you begin noticing the vibration it produces. You can ask a quiet question within yourself. Is this the tone I want guiding my next actions? If the answer is no, you are free to shift the direction of attention. This does not mean pretending that difficulties do not exist or forcing artificial positivity. It means choosing a perspective that allows movement rather than paralysis. For example, instead of repeating the thought that a situation is hopeless, you might focus on the next step that can be taken. Instead of dwelling on criticism, you may consider what can be learned from the feedback. Each shift changes the vibration of the inner atmosphere. The remarkable aspect of this process is that the mind gradually adapts to the tone you choose most often. When constructive interpretations become more frequent, the passive mind begins expecting them. Emotional reactions stabilize. Situations that once triggered immediate frustration begin to feel manageable. The vibration of the mind becomes steadier because it is no longer determined entirely by external conditions. This stability has a subtle influence on the way you interact with the world. Conversations become clearer because you are not speaking from constant reaction. Decisions become more deliberate because your thinking is less clouded by fluctuating emotions. Opportunities become easier to recognize because attention is not consumed by negative interpretations of every obstacle. Inner authority also brings a quiet sense of independence. Many people unknowingly surrender control of their emotional atmosphere to the opinions or behavior of others. A single comment can determine the tone of the entire day. When you begin choosing your inner vibration deliberately, this dependence weakens. Other people's words still matter, but they no longer dictate the direction of your thinking. Developing this authority requires patience because it involves replacing long-standing habits of reaction. The mind may initially return to familiar patterns of worry or frustration. When that happens, the goal is not to criticize yourself for the reaction. Instead, simply notice it and redirect attention again. Each redirection strengthens the awareness that you have the ability to choose the tone of your thoughts. Over time, the shift becomes more noticeable. Situations that once triggered immediate emotional turbulence begin producing a moment of observation instead. Within that moment, the quiet power of choice appears. You recognize that the vibration guiding your next response does not have to be the one that arrived first. And when that realization settles into daily life, The inner world begins to feel less like a place where thoughts push you in every direction and more like a space where attention can be guided with calm and deliberate authority. Stand beside the ocean and watch the water carefully. On the surface, the waves appear chaotic, each one rising and falling without pattern. Yet beneath that restless movement there are powerful currents flowing in steady directions. These currents can carry objects for miles without those objects ever realizing what is moving them. Human thought operates in a remarkably similar way. Beyond the private thinking that takes place in each mind, there exists a vast current of collective thought flowing through society. It is formed by millions of voices, fears, expectations, opinion, and emotional reactions repeating themselves day after day. Most people live inside this current without ever recognizing it. Turn on the news, scroll through social media, listen to conversations in crowded places, and you will quickly notice the tone of this collective atmosphere. Anxiety spreads rapidly. Outrage travels faster than calm reflection. Negative predictions about the future often receive more attention than hopeful possibilities. The human mind has a natural tendency to focus on danger because survival once depended on noticing threats quickly. As a result, the collective current of thought frequently leans toward worry, criticism, and alarm. When you are constantly exposed to this atmosphere, it becomes easy for the mind to absorb it unconsciously. Thoughts that did not originate within you begin appearing in your own awareness. Worries about events far away start shaping your mood. Opinions repeated by thousands of voices begin feeling like personal convictions. Without noticing the process, the emotional climate of the collective mind begins shaping your individual thinking. This is why many people feel mentally exhausted, even when nothing dramatic has happened in their personal lives. They are carrying the emotional weight of a much larger conversation that surrounds them every day. The mind absorbs impressions from the environment just as the lungs absorb air. If the atmosphere is filled with tension, the inner world gradually begins reflecting that tension. Rising above the negative current of collective thought does not mean isolating yourself from the world or ignoring reality. It means becoming aware of the influence that collective thinking can have on your inner state and choosing not to drift along with it automatically. The moment you recognize that a current exists, you gain the ability to swim rather than simply float wherever it carries you. The first step in this process is observation. Notice how easily certain emotional tones spread through groups of people. A single rumor can generate widespread anxiety. A moment of public anger can trigger waves of reaction across entire communities. These responses often happen so quickly that individuals assume they are thinking independently, when in fact they are participating in a shared emotional momentum. When you begin observing this phenomenon, something important changes inside your mind. Instead of reacting immediately to every emotional signal circulating around you, you pause and examine it. You ask yourself whether the thought or emotion truly belongs to you, or whether it has simply been absorbed from the surrounding environment. This small moment of awareness creates distance between your inner world and the collective current. Another helpful practice is becoming selective about the information you repeatedly expose your mind to. Just as physical health depends on the quality of the food you consume, mental clarity depends on the quality of the impressions you allow into your awareness. Constant exposure to fear-based narratives, endless argument, or sensational headlines gradually shapes the tone of your thinking. Limiting that exposure does not mean denying reality. It simply means refusing to let the most chaotic voices dominate your inner atmosphere. When the mind becomes quieter and less reactive to external noise, a different quality of awareness begins to emerge. Instead of constantly responding to the emotional temperature of the crowd, you begin noticing your own thoughts more clearly. This clarity allows you to choose the tone you want guiding your life, rather than inheriting the tone that happens to be circulating around you. There is also a subtle strength that develops when you maintain a calm mental state in the midst of widespread emotional turbulence. In a room filled with agitation, the presence of someone who remains steady often changes the entire atmosphere. Their calm responses interrupt the cycle of reaction. Their patience allows conversations to slow down, without forcing anything. Their mental stability becomes a kind of anchor for others. This influence works because human beings naturally respond to emotional resonance. When many people are caught in a wave of fear or anger, The mind searches for signals that reinforce that emotion. But when a steady and thoughtful presence appears, it offers an alternative pattern for the mind to follow. Over time, that alternative becomes attractive because it provides relief from the exhausting intensity of collective reaction. Maintaining this steadiness requires conscious attention. The collective current will always exist, and it will often be loud. There will always be moments when large groups of people move together through waves of excitement, fear, or frustration. You do not need to fight against these movements or attempt to correct every opinion you encounter. What matters more is protecting the clarity of your own inner world. Each time you choose thoughtful reflection instead of immediate reaction, you step slightly outside the current. Each time you return your attention to constructive ideas instead of repeating collective worries, you strengthen the independence of your mind. Gradually, this independence becomes a habit. The surrounding atmosphere may still contain tension, but it no longer determines the tone of your thinking. The remarkable result of this shift is that life begins to feel quieter and more stable, even while the world around you continues to change. Events still occur, conversations still unfold, and news still circulates. Yet your inner world no longer rises and falls with every wave of collective emotion. The mind stands on firmer ground, and once that stability becomes familiar, the noise of the crowd begins to sound less like a command you must obey and more like a distant tide moving across the surface of the ocean while you remain aware of the deeper water beneath it. Imagine trying to push a heavy object through thick mud. Every step requires force. Every movement feels slow and exhausting. The more you push, the more resistance you feel beneath your feet. Now, imagine stepping onto solid ground where movement becomes effortless. The distance you travel may be the same, but the environment has changed completely. Much of human effort operates in a similar way. Many people attempt to fight their difficulties directly, pushing harder against problems, arguing with circumstances, resisting emotions, and trying to overpower every obstacle through force. Yet there is another approach that often proves far more powerful. Instead of pushing harder against resistance, you rise above it by changing the mental atmosphere from which you are operating. Resistance begins in the mind, long before it appears in external conditions. When a challenge arises, the immediate reaction of many people is tension. Thoughts of frustration appear. The mind begins rehearsing arguments about why the situation should not exist. Energy becomes trapped in the act of pushing against the problem itself. Ironically, this mental struggle often strengthens the very condition being resisted because attention remains fixed on it. You can see this pattern clearly when someone repeatedly says, "I must stop thinking about this problem." The more they attempt to suppress the thought, the more frequently it appears. Their attention is still tied to the same idea. Even though they are trying to push it away, the mind remains in the same mental atmosphere, circling around the difficulty rather than moving beyond it. Elevation works differently. Instead of struggling against a particular thought or circumstance, you shift the entire level of your thinking. Imagine an airplane lifting above a storm. The clouds below may still be filled with turbulence, but the aircraft moves into a layer of clear sky where the air is calm. The storm has not disappeared, yet its influence has changed because the altitude has changed. In mental life, elevation occurs when you deliberately move your attention toward a higher emotional and intellectual state. Rather than concentrating on the frustration of the obstacle, you turn your focus toward clarity, possibility, and purposeful action. This does not mean denying the existence of the challenge. It means refusing to let the challenge dominate the atmosphere of your thinking. For example, suppose a plan you have been working toward suddenly encounters an unexpected setback. The reaction of resistance might involve replaying the disappointment repeatedly, analyzing every aspect of the failure, or mentally arguing with the circumstances that caused it. Hours or even days may pass while the mind remains trapped in the same emotional environment. Elevation introduces a different response. You acknowledge the setback, but instead of dwelling on it, you begin asking constructive questions. What can be learned from this moment? What alternative paths exist? What resources are still available? These questions move the mind into a higher atmosphere where creativity and problem-solving become possible. The energy that was once spent resisting the situation now becomes available for discovering solutions. Another example appears in everyday interactions with other people. When someone speaks harshly or behaves unfairly, the instinctive response is often to react at the same emotional level. Anger meets anger. Criticism meets criticism. The conversation quickly becomes a cycle of escalating tension. Resistance keeps both individuals locked within the same mental atmosphere. Elevation interrupts that cycle. Instead of responding from the same emotional tone, you maintain calm awareness. You listen carefully and respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively. The higher atmosphere of patience changes the direction of the interaction. Sometimes the other person gradually mirrors that calmness. Even when they do not, your own mental clarity remains intact because you did not descend into the same emotional turbulence. Holding a higher mental atmosphere requires awareness because the mind naturally gravitates toward familiar emotional patterns. If frustration has been practiced for many years, the mind may return to it automatically. Elevation does not occur through a single decision but through repeated choices. Each time you redirect attention toward clarity instead of reaction, you strengthen the ability to remain in that higher state. This process becomes easier when you cultivate certain mental habits. Gratitude, curiosity, and purposeful imagination all raise the emotional tone of the mind. When you regularly reflect on what is working well in your life, your attention becomes less vulnerable to the gravitational pull of temporary setbacks. Curiosity opens the mind to new ideas rather than closing it in judgment. Imagination allows you to envision solutions before they appear in physical form. Over time, these habits form a stable inner environment. Instead of constantly shifting between emotional highs and lows, the mind begins operating from a steady baseline of calm focus. Problems still arise, but they no longer dominate your entire mental landscape. They become situations to navigate rather than battles to fight. The remarkable aspect of this elevated state is that it often influences external events in subtle ways. When you approach situations from clarity instead of resistance, your actions become more thoughtful and effective. Conversations become more productive because your responses carry patience rather than agitation. Opportunities that once seemed hidden become easier to recognize because your attention is no longer trapped in frustration. People sometimes believe that elevation requires extraordinary discipline or spiritual perfection. In reality, it begins with very simple moments of awareness. Each time you notice yourself becoming absorbed in resistance, you pause. Instead of pushing harder against the problem, you lift your attention toward a broader perspective. That shift may feel small, yet it gradually transforms the entire atmosphere of the mind. As this practice deepens, challenges begin to appear less like barriers and more like signals inviting a different level of thinking. Resistance loses much of its power because the mind no longer remains trapped within the same emotional environment where the problem first appeared. And when that higher atmosphere becomes familiar, difficulties that once felt overwhelming begin to look like passing clouds drifting far below the quiet altitude of your awareness. Look carefully at any meaningful achievement in human life, and you will usually discover that it began with something simple and almost invisible, a desire. Before the invention appears, before the action is taken, before the visible result exists, there is first a quiet movement within the mind that says, something more is possible. That movement may appear as a wish for improvement, a longing for change, or a vision of a different future, whatever form it takes. Desire is often the very first signal that creation has already begun within consciousness. Many people misunderstand desire. Some believe it is a weakness, something that should be suppressed in order to remain content. Others assume that desire is merely a fantasy, a pleasant thought with little connection to reality. Yet when you observe life closely, desire rarely appears without purpose. It often emerges as a kind of inner compass pointing toward potential growth. Think about how a seed behaves beneath the soil. Long before the plant breaks through the surface, a quiet process is unfolding beneath the ground. The seed contains a hidden impulse toward expansion. It reaches toward light that it has never seen, responding to an internal pattern guiding its growth. Human desire often functions in a similar way. It signals the direction in which the mind is ready to expand. When you feel a genuine desire for a new possibility, whether it involves learning, creating, helping others, or improving your circumstances, that impulse is not random. It represents a recognition within your consciousness that something more can be expressed through you. The desire itself becomes the first movement of that expression. However, many people interrupt this process before it develops. The moment a new desire appears, the analytical mind quickly begins questioning it. Is this realistic? What if it fails? What will others think? These doubts are not inherently wrong. They are simply attempts by the mind to maintain familiarity. The passive mind tends to protect existing patterns, and anything new may initially feel uncertain. Yet if every desire is dismissed the moment it appears, the mind remains trapped within the boundaries of past experience. Nothing truly new can emerge because every possibility is judged according to what has already happened. Creation requires a brief willingness to allow the desire to exist before demanding immediate proof. This is where the imagination becomes important. When you give attention to a desire and allow yourself to picture it clearly, you begin forming an impression in the deeper layers of the mind. The image does not yet represent a physical reality, but it begins shaping the internal environment from which actions and decisions arise. The passive mind starts recognizing the possibility as something familiar rather than something impossible. Many individuals who accomplish remarkable things describe a similar process. Before they had resources, support, or certainty, they carried a clear inner picture of what they wanted to bring into existence. They returned to that picture repeatedly. Over time, their thoughts, decisions, and actions gradually aligned with the direction suggested by that original desire. This does not mean that every desire should be followed without reflection. Some impulses arise from temporary emotions or external pressure. The desires that lead to meaningful creation usually carry a different quality. They tend to persist quietly in the background of your thinking even when you try to ignore them. They return in moments of reflection, reminding you of a possibility that feels both challenging and strangely natural. Another important aspect of desire is the emotional energy it provides. When you truly care about something, your attention naturally returns to it. Curiosity grows. Effort feels meaningful rather than burdensome. The mind becomes more willing to learn and adapt because the goal carries personal significance. Desire fuels persistence, and persistence is often the bridge between imagination and reality. However, desire alone is not enough. The mind must also learn to hold the idea with clarity rather than allowing it to dissolve into distraction. This is where the will, discussed earlier, begins working alongside desire. The keeps returning attention to the vision while the imagination strengthens the impression behind it. Together they transform a simple wish into a guiding mental pattern. As this pattern grows stronger, something subtle begins to change in the way you perceive the world. Opportunities related to the desire become more visible. Conversations suddenly contain relevant information. Ideas that once seemed unrelated begin forming connections. It may appear as though circumstances are rearranging themselves, but what is actually happening is that your awareness has become more sensitive to signals aligned with the direction of your desire. This process often unfolds gradually rather than dramatically. Small actions lead to new insights. New insights lead to further steps. The original desire continues guiding attention even when progress seems slow. What began as a quiet impulse gradually becomes a structured path of movement through the world. There is also a deeper philosophical dimension to desire that many spiritual teachers have pointed out. They suggest that desire may not simply originate from the individual ego, but from a deeper creative intelligence expressing itself through the individual mind. In this view, the longing to create, improve, or contribute is part of the same universal impulse that drives growth throughout nature. Whether you interpret desire as psychological motivation or spiritual guidance, its practical effect remains the same. It initiates movement. Without desire, the mind tends to remain within familiar routines. With desire, attention begins exploring new directions. The future opens slightly wider than the past. Understanding desire in this way transforms how you respond when a new idea or longing appears within your mind. Instead of dismissing it immediately as unrealistic or indulgent, You observe it more carefully. You allow the possibility to exist long enough for the imagination to examine it. You give the mind space to consider what might unfold if that desire were followed with patience and clarity. And, when that small but persistent impulse is allowed to remain in your awareness, it often reveals itself not as a passing wish, but as the quiet beginning of something that has already started moving within the unseen landscape of thought. A desire by itself is like a spark. It contains the beginning of energy, the possibility of warmth, the promise of light. But a single spark does not yet become a fire. For a flame to grow, the spark must meet fuel, oxygen, and the right environment. In much the same way, a desire within the human mind does not automatically turn into reality simply because it exists. Desire must align with belief, commitment, and a state of inner readiness before it begins producing visible results in life. Many people experience moments of strong desire. They imagine a better future, a new opportunity, a healthier relationship, or a meaningful project. For a moment, the vision feels vivid and inspiring. But after the excitement fades, another voice often appears in the mind. It quietly asks, "Is this really possible for me?" The moment doubt enters, the desire begins losing its momentum. The spark has appeared, but the conditions needed to sustain it have not yet formed. Belief is the first of those conditions. Belief does not mean blind optimism or pretending that challenges do not exist. It means the mind gradually accepting the possibility that the desired outcome belongs within the range of your life. When belief is present, the mind stops arguing against the desire. Instead of constantly questioning whether the vision is realistic, attention begins exploring how it might unfold. You can observe the power of belief in everyday behavior. When a person truly believes that improvement is possible, they approach problems differently. They experiment, learn from mistakes, and remain curious about new strategies. But when belief is absent, even simple obstacles feel overwhelming. The mind interprets every setback as confirmation that the desire was unrealistic from the beginning. Belief rarely appears instantly. It often develops through repeated exposure to new ideas and experiences. Each small success strengthens it. Each example of progress, whether in your own life or in the lives of others, adds another layer of evidence to the mind. Over time, the passive mind begins accepting the idea that the desired outcome belongs within the realm of possibility. Commitment is the second element that allows desire to grow. Desire without commitment behaves like a passing interest. It appears briefly and then disappears when attention moves elsewhere. Commitment changes that pattern by anchoring the desire within your daily thinking and behavior. When you are committed to something, your attention repeatedly returns to it. Decisions begin aligning with it. Effort becomes consistent rather than occasional. Think about the difference between someone who casually wishes to improve their life and someone who is deeply committed to doing so. The first person may think about change only when circumstances feel uncomfortable. The second person thinks about it regularly, studies it, practices it, and adjusts their actions accordingly. The same desire may exist in both individuals, but commitment determines whether that desire remains an idea or becomes a direction guiding their life. Commitment also provides stability during moments of uncertainty. Every meaningful pursuit encounters periods when progress seems slow or unclear. Without commitment, those moments easily dissolve the original desire. But when commitment is present, the mind remains steady even when immediate results are not visible. The individual continues moving forward because the direction has already been chosen. The third element in this alignment is inner readiness. This aspect is often overlooked, yet it plays a crucial role in the manifestation of desire. Inner readiness refers to the emotional and psychological state that allows you to receive and sustain the outcome you seek. Sometimes people desire change, but their internal patterns have not yet adapted to support it. For example, a person may desire success while still carrying deep fears about responsibility or visibility. Another individual may long for a fulfilling relationship while holding unresolved beliefs about trust or self-worth. In these situations, the desire exists, but the inner environment remains unprepared to sustain the result. The mind unconsciously resists the very outcome it claims to want. Inner readiness develops through self-awareness and gradual transformation of these underlying patterns. As you examine your thoughts and emotional responses, you begin identifying beliefs that may conflict with your desire. Instead of ignoring them, you work patiently to reshape them. Confidence replaces self-doubt. Clarity replaces confusion. The inner environment gradually becomes compatible with the vision you hold. This alignment between desire, belief, commitment, and readiness creates a powerful momentum within the mind. The desire provides direction. Belief removes internal resistance. Commitment sustains consistent attention. Inner readiness ensures that the outcome can be welcomed without fear or contradiction. Together they form the psychological conditions necessary for meaningful creation. One interesting aspect of this alignment is that it often changes the way time feels. When the mind is scattered, progress appears slow because attention constantly shifts. But when these four elements begin working together, movement becomes more coherent. Actions follow a clear direction. Opportunities appear connected rather than random. Even small steps begin contributing to a larger pattern. It is also important to recognize that alignment does not require perfection. Doubts may still appear from time to time. Energy may fluctuate. What matters most is the overall direction of your thinking and effort. Each time belief is reinforced, commitment renewed, or inner readiness strengthened, the alignment becomes more stable. Many people search for external techniques that promise instant transformation, hoping that a single method will deliver their desires without requiring deeper inner change. Yet the most reliable process tends to be quieter and more gradual. It involves cultivating a state of mind that naturally supports the direction you wish to move. When desire, belief, commitment, and readiness finally converge, the experience often feels less like forcing life to change and more like stepping into a path that was gradually forming all along. The spark that once appeared as a simple wish now burns steadily because the conditions around it have become strong enough to sustain the flame. Imagine a gardener standing before a fertile piece of land. The soil is rich, deep, and capable of growing almost anything that is planted within it. If the gardener places seeds of fruit trees into the soil, the land will eventually produce fruit. If weeds are scattered across the same ground, weeds will grow just as faithfully. The soil does not argue with the seed. It does not judge whether the plant is useful or harmful. It simply receives what is planted and quietly multiplies it. The subconscious mind behaves in a remarkably similar way. It is the fertile ground beneath your conscious thoughts, and autosuggestion is the method by which you choose what seeds are placed into that ground. Autosuggestion simply means influencing your subconscious mind through repeated statements, image, and emotional impressions that you intentionally give to yourself. The word may sound technical, but the process is something every person already performs throughout their life, often without realizing it. Each time you repeat an idea to yourself, especially with feeling, you are sending a suggestion into the deeper layers of your mind. For example, someone who constantly says, "I always fail at things like this," may believe they are merely expressing frustration, yet each repetition plants a suggestion. The subconscious mind absorbs the pattern and gradually begins reinforcing it through automatic emotional reactions and expectations. When the next opportunity appears, the person feels hesitation before they even begin. The mind is simply expressing the suggestion it has already accepted. The same mechanism can work in a constructive direction when it is used deliberately. When you repeatedly impress an empowering idea upon your mind, such as confidence, clarity, persistence, or growth, the subconscious gradually absorbs that idea as a new pattern. Over time, the emotional tone of your thinking begins aligning with the suggestion you have planted. One important aspect of autosuggestion is that the subconscious mind responds most strongly to repetition combined with feeling. A single statement spoken without attention rarely leaves a deep impression, but a statement repeated consistently with genuine emotional engagement gradually becomes familiar to the mind. The subconscious begins treating it as a reality to support. This is why many teachers of mental discipline encourage daily practices of affirmation or focused self-talk. When someone calmly repeats an idea such as, "I am developing strength and clarity in my thinking," the purpose is not to convince others, The purpose is to influence the internal patterns of the subconscious mind. With enough repetition, the idea begins shaping automatic reactions and expectations. However, autosuggestion is not effective when it is performed mechanically. If a person repeats a statement while simultaneously believing the opposite, the subconscious receives conflicting impressions. The suggestion must feel at least partially believable to the conscious mind. It is often helpful to phrase suggestions in ways that emphasize growth and progress rather than exaggerated claims. For instance, instead of repeating, "I am perfectly confident in every situation," which may feel unrealistic, a more natural suggestion might be, "My confidence grows stronger each day as I practice calm thinking." This phrasing allows the conscious mind to accept the direction of the statement, while the subconscious absorbs the pattern behind it. Another powerful form of autosuggestion involves visualization. When you imagine yourself experiencing a desired outcome with clear sensory detail, the subconscious mind responds almost as though the experience were real. The emotions connected to the imagined scene strengthen the impression being planted. Over time, the subconscious begins aligning your reactions and behaviors with the mental image you have repeated. Athletes frequently use this technique when preparing for competition. They visualize the exact movements of their performance, the environment around them, and the emotional state they wish to maintain. By repeating these images mentally, they install patterns of confidence and coordination before the actual event occurs. The subconscious then expresses those patterns automatically when the moment arrives. The timing of autosuggestion also plays an interesting role. Many people find that suggestions are more easily absorbed when the mind is relaxed, such as during the moments before sleep or shortly after waking. In these quiet states, the boundary between conscious thought and subconscious absorption becomes more open. Repeating a constructive idea during these moments allows it to sink more deeply into the mental soil. It is also important to recognize that autosuggestion is always occurring, whether you use it intentionally or not. Every repeated complaint, worry, or self-criticism functions as an unintentional suggestion. The subconscious does not distinguish between ideas you deliberately choose and ideas you repeat casually. It responds to whichever thoughts appear most frequently and with the strongest emotional tone. Because of this, awareness becomes the first step in mastering autosuggestion. When you begin observing your internal dialogue, you may notice certain phrases that appear again and again. Some may support your growth, while others quietly reinforce limitation. Simply recognizing these patterns allows you to decide which ones deserve reinforcement and which ones should gradually fade from repetition. With consistent practice, autosuggestion becomes less like a forced technique and more like a natural habit of guiding your own thinking. You begin choosing words and images that align with the direction you want your life to move. The subconscious mind, faithful to its role as the fertile soil of your inner world, gradually organizes your emotional responses and expectations around those suggestions. As time passes, the results of this planting process begin appearing in subtle ways. Confidence replaces hesitation in situations that once felt intimidating. Creativity emerges more easily because the mind has been trained to look for solutions. Opportunities become more noticeable because your expectations have shifted toward possibility. None of these changes happen instantly. Just as seeds do not become trees overnight, but the process unfolds quietly beneath the surface. Each suggestion, planted with attention and feeling, becomes another seed resting in the soil of the subconscious, waiting patiently for the conditions that allow it to grow. Take a moment and imagine a compass. No matter where it is placed, the needle eventually settles in a clear direction. It does not spin endlessly unless something is interfering with its magnetic field. Once the disturbance disappears, the needle aligns again with quiet certainty. The human mind behaves in a similar way when thought and feeling move together in harmony. When they are aligned, your inner world develops a powerful clarity that begins attracting corresponding experiences. When they are in conflict, however, the mind becomes like a compass spinning in every direction, unable to settle on a clear path. Many people believe they are thinking positively while their emotions quietly communicate the opposite message. They repeat encouraging ideas in their mind, yet deep inside they feel doubt, tension, or fear. In this situation, the mind is sending mixed signals. The conscious thought moves toward possibility, while the emotional atmosphere pulls in the opposite direction. Because the subconscious mind responds strongly to emotion, the deeper signal often becomes the one that shapes behavior and perception. This is why coherence between thought and feeling is so important. Coherence means that the idea you hold in your mind and the emotional state you carry in your body are moving in the same direction. When a person thinks about progress and also feels hopeful, their entire mental system supports that orientation. Attention becomes sharper, decisions become clearer, and actions begin aligning naturally with the desired outcome. You can observe the opposite effect when thought and emotion conflict with each other. Someone may say, "I believe things will improve," yet internally they feel anxious and expect disappointment. The words express optimism, but the emotional vibration communicates doubt, because the two signals do not match. The mind struggles to maintain a consistent direction. Opportunities may appear, yet hesitation interferes with action. Becoming a mental magnet begins with recognizing this relationship between thought and feeling. Instead of focusing only on the words you repeat to yourself, you begin noticing the emotional tone accompanying those words. Do they create a sense of openness and possibility, or do they carry tension and uncertainty? The emotional atmosphere reveals whether your thoughts are truly aligned with your inner belief. One effective way to build coherence is through vivid imagination, combined with genuine emotional engagement. When you imagine a desired outcome in detail, seeing the environment, sensing the atmosphere, and feeling the satisfaction of achieving it, the mind begins experiencing the idea as something real rather than distant. The emotional response strengthens the mental image, and the subconscious mind gradually accepts it as a natural possibility. This process is similar to how musicians practice a new piece of music. At first, the notes may feel awkward and disconnected, but with repetition, the hands and emotions begin moving together. The music becomes fluid because the body and mind are aligned in the same rhythm. In mental life, coherence works in a similar way. The more often your thoughts and emotions support the same vision, the more naturally your behavior begins expressing it. Another important factor in developing this mental magnetism is consistency. A single moment of inspiration rarely changes the direction of a person's life, but when a particular thought and feeling are repeated regularly, they gradually become the dominant pattern of the mind. The subconscious begins recognizing this pattern as familiar and safe. As a result, it supports actions that align with that orientation. Consider how someone who consistently imagines progress while feeling grateful for small improvements begins approaching challenges differently. Their attention shifts towards solutions rather than obstacles. They notice opportunities others might overlook because their emotional state keeps them engaged rather than discouraged. Over time, this alignment between thought and feeling creates momentum. The idea of becoming a mental magnet does not mean forcing the world to deliver whatever you want instantly. Instead, it means organizing your internal world so clearly that your attention, decisions, and actions naturally move toward the experiences you seek. When the inner signal becomes consistent, the path forward often becomes easier to recognize. It is also important to remember that emotions cannot be forced artificially. Attempting to suppress genuine feelings or pretend that difficulties do not exist often creates internal resistance. Coherence develops through honest awareness. When you notice discouraging emotions, acknowledge them calmly rather than denying them. Then gradually shift your attention toward ideas that inspire a more constructive response. As the mind becomes familiar with this shift, the emotional tone begins changing more naturally. Another aspect of mental magnetism involves the environment you create around yourself. The people you spend time with, the ideas you read or listen to, and the conversations you participate in all influence your emotional state. When your surroundings reinforce clarity, curiosity, and growth, maintaining coherence between thought and feeling becomes easier. When the environment constantly feeds fear or negativity, the mind must work harder to maintain its chosen direction. Over time, as coherence becomes more stable, something subtle begins changing in the way you experience everyday life. Situations that once triggered confusion now evoke curiosity. Challenges that once caused discouragement begin stimulating creative thinking. The emotional baseline of the mind becomes calmer and more confident because the signals within it are no longer contradictory. At this point, the metaphor of the magnet becomes easier to understand. When iron filings are scattered across a surface, they remain disorganized until a magnet is introduced. The magnetic field quietly arranges them into a clear pattern. In the same way, coherent thought and feeling create an invisible field that organizes attention, perception, and behavior around a central direction. And as that alignment grows stronger, the mind no longer feels like a collection of competing impulses, but more like a steady force, moving with quiet certainty toward the possibilities it has learned to recognize as its own. Walk into a room where sunlight pours through the window and the light seems soft, scattered, and gentle. It illuminates everything equally but transforms nothing. Now imagine that same sunlight passing through a lens. The light narrows into a single point, and suddenly something remarkable happens. The scattered warmth becomes concentrated energy capable of igniting a flame. The light itself has not changed, only its direction and focus have. The creative power of the mind works in exactly the same way. Most people possess far more mental energy than they realize. Yet that energy is often scattered across countless thoughts throughout the day. One moment attention moves toward a new goal. The next moment it shifts toward worry about the future. A few minutes later it drifts into memories of past events or reactions to conversations and distractions. Because the mind constantly changes direction, the creative current within it rarely gathers enough momentum to produce meaningful change. Focus is the ability to direct that current deliberately and keep it flowing in a chosen direction long enough for something new to form. When the mind learns to remain centered on a clear idea, thought becomes more than simple imagination. It becomes a guiding force, shaping perception, decisions, and actions. Consider how a river behaves when it flows freely across a wide plain. The water spreads out, forming many small channels, and its movement becomes slow and shallow. But when the same water passes through a narrow canyon, it gathers strength and speed. The river becomes powerful because its direction has been concentrated. Human attention functions in a similar way. When attention flows toward many different ideas at once, progress feels slow and uncertain. When it is directed toward one clear intention, momentum begins to build. The challenge most people encounter is not a lack of desire, but a lack of sustained focus. At the beginning of a new goal, enthusiasm often appears naturally. The mind imagines possibilities, and motivation feels strong. Yet as days pass, distractions gradually weaken that attention. New concerns arise. Old habits return. The original vision becomes one thought among many rather than the central direction guiding daily life. Consistency is what transforms focus from a temporary effort into a creative force. Each time attention returns to the same idea, the impression in the subconscious mind deepens. The thought becomes familiar rather than distant. Eventually, the mind begins orienting itself around that idea automatically. Decisions align with it. Opportunities connected to it become more visible. Actions begin reflecting the direction the mind has repeatedly chosen. You can see this principle clearly in any skill that requires mastery. A musician does not become skilled through a single day of practice, but through consistent attention to the same patterns of sound and movement. An athlete develops strength through repeated training rather than occasional effort. In the same way, the creative power of the mind grows stronger when attention repeatedly returns to a chosen vision. This does not mean ignoring every other aspect of life. Focus does not require narrowing your world to a single thought all day long. Instead, it means establishing a central direction that your mind returns to regularly. Even when daily responsibilities pull attention elsewhere, the underlying intention remains present in your awareness. One helpful way to strengthen this ability is through intentional periods of quiet reflection. When the mind becomes still for a few minutes, you can revisit the vision or purpose guiding your actions. You may imagine the outcome clearly, feel the emotional satisfaction connected to it, and remind yourself why it matters. These moments act like realigning the compass of your mind, ensuring that attention continues moving in the desired direction. Another aspect of focus involves learning how to handle distractions without frustration. Distractions are natural. The mind is constantly exposed to new information and emotional signals. The key difference lies in how quickly you return to your chosen direction. Each time you notice attention drifting and gently guide it back, you strengthen the habit of focus. The return itself becomes part of the training process. It is also important to recognize that focus influences not only what you achieve, but how you experience the journey toward it. When attention is scattered, life often feels chaotic and reactive. Events appear disconnected, and progress seems unpredictable. But when attention is guided by a clear intention, daily experiences begin forming a pattern. Even small actions feel meaningful because they contribute to the larger direction you have chosen. There is a quiet confidence that develops through this process. Instead of constantly wondering whether progress is possible, the mind becomes familiar with steady movement. Each focused effort becomes another step along a path that gradually reveals itself through continued attention. Focus also protects the mind from the constant emotional turbulence of the external world. News, opinion, and unexpected events will always attempt to pull attention in different directions. When you maintain a clear internal focus, these influences lose much of their power. You notice them, but they do not dictate your mental atmosphere. The creative current of your thinking remains directed toward what you have chosen to build. Over time, this consistency begins producing results that may appear surprising to others. People often describe focused individuals as disciplined, determined, or unusually fortunate. Yet beneath those descriptions lies a simple pattern. Attention has been directed steadily in one direction long enough for the creative process to unfold. The power of focus is not dramatic or sudden. It works quietly through repetition and clarity. Each moment of sustained attention strengthens the path you are creating within the mind. The creative current flows more smoothly with every return to that direction. And when that current continues long enough without interruption, what once existed only as a thought gradually begins appearing as a visible part of your life. Not because the idea was forced into existence, but because the mind learned how to guide its energy with steady and consistent focus. There comes a quiet moment in the journey of understanding when a person begins to see life differently. Not because the world itself has suddenly changed, but because the relationship between the inner world and the outer world has become clearer. Many people spend years believing that circumstances determine their thoughts, their emotions, and ultimately their direction in life. If conditions are favorable, they feel hopeful. If conditions become difficult, they feel defeated. Their inner state rises and falls like a small boat carried by waves. Yet the deeper teaching behind everything you have explored is that the mind was never meant to drift helplessly on those waves. It was designed to learn how to align itself consciously with a higher level of awareness. Living above circumstance does not mean ignoring reality or pretending that challenges do not exist. It means understanding that external events are only one part of the equation. The other part, often the more powerful one, is the state of consciousness from which you respond to those events. Two individuals can face the same conditions, yet move in completely different directions because their inner alignment is different. You have probably witnessed this in ordinary life. One person encounters a difficulty and immediately assumes defeat. Their thinking becomes heavy, their energy fades, and their actions slow down. The circumstance becomes a barrier that stops movement entirely. Another person meets the same difficulty but interprets it differently. Instead of focusing only on the obstacle, they look for what can still be done. Their mind searches for alternatives, adjustments, and lessons. The circumstance remains the same, but the response creates a completely different path forward. This difference begins with conscious alignment. Alignment simply means bringing your thoughts, emotions, and intentions into harmony with the direction you want your life to move. When the mind is scattered, filled with doubt one moment and hope the next, your inner state becomes unstable. Decisions feel uncertain because the mind is constantly shifting between opposing signals. But when alignment develops, the inner world becomes steady. Thoughts support your intentions, emotions reinforce your vision, and actions naturally follow that orientation. One of the most important aspects of living above circumstance is recognizing that your internal state does not have to mirror the environment around you. The world will always contain moments of confusion, conflict, and unpredictability. If your inner state automatically absorbs every external condition, your peace of mind will always depend on factors you cannot control. Conscious alignment creates a different possibility. It allows you to maintain clarity even while navigating complex situations. This ability often begins with simple awareness. When an unexpected event occurs, the first reaction of the mind may be emotional, perhaps frustration, worry, or disappointment. These reactions are natural, but conscious alignment introduces a second step: observation. Instead of allowing the initial emotion to dominate your thinking, you pause long enough to examine it. In that pause, the deeper part of your awareness becomes active. From this perspective, you can ask yourself a different question. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you might ask, "How do I want to respond to this moment?" That question shifts the focus from circumstance to choice. It reminds you that while events may arise unexpectedly, your response remains within your influence. Over time, practicing this shift begins to change the emotional atmosphere of your life. Situations that once produced immediate stress become opportunities for deliberate response. The mind learns to step back from reaction and move toward thoughtful action. This does not eliminate challenges, but it transforms the way those challenges are experienced. Another dimension of conscious alignment involves maintaining connection with the larger vision guiding your life. When attention is focused only on immediate circumstances, even small obstacles can appear overwhelming. But when the mind remembers the broader direction it has chosen, individual difficulties begin to look like temporary parts of a much larger journey. Think of a traveler crossing a mountain range. If they focus only on the steepness of the current path, the climb may feel discouraging. But if they remember the destination waiting beyond the mountains, each step becomes meaningful. The same perspective applies to life. When your thoughts remain aligned with your deeper purpose, the temporary terrain of circumstance loses much of its power to discourage you. Conscious alignment also influences the way you interact with other people. When your inner state is stable, you become less reactive to the moods and opinions surrounding you. Instead of absorbing every emotional signal from others, you maintain your own center of awareness. Conversations become more thoughtful because you are not responding impulsively. Relationships become more balanced because your reactions are guided by clarity rather than by momentary emotion. As this alignment strengthens, something subtle begins changing in the way life unfolds around you. Opportunities that once seemed hidden become easier to recognize because your attention is not consumed by worry. Creative solutions appear more frequently because the mind remains open rather than defensive. Even during uncertain periods, a quiet sense of direction remains present beneath the surface. People sometimes describe this state as resilience, calm confidence, or spiritual maturity. Yet at its core, it is simply the result of practicing alignment between your thoughts, your emotions, and the vision guiding your life. The mind becomes a steady instrument rather than a collection of conflicting impulses. Eventually, you may notice that circumstances no longer define the tone of your life as strongly as they once did. Challenges still appear, successes still arrive, and the rhythm of events continues to move. But your inner state remains anchored in a deeper awareness that does not depend entirely on what is happening outside you. And from that place of conscious alignment, life begins to feel less like a series of reactions to unpredictable events and more like a continuous expression of the direction your awareness has chosen to follow.